It was a time of prosperity and hope, a time of promise and expectation. When the robust presidential candidacy of Herbert Hoover began in 1928, America was riding waves of optimism and opportunity. The Republican Party even promoted the bold notion of eliminating poverty during the tenure of a Hoover presidency. Thanks to his unprecedented success in the mining business, his humanitarian leadership in response to World War I, and his 2 terms as Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover was among the most highly regarded men in America.
He seemed to fit the times in '28. Hoover was a landslide president. He had a mandate. He had a majority of people with him.
He had a sense of America as a special place in the world. He had a strong sense, if you will, of American exceptionalism.
He had more brains than most people, and he knew a lot more than most people about almost everything. And yet, that wasn't enough.
4 years later, the nation and the world were mired in the worst depression in modern history.
In '32, 4 years later, he couldn't have been more out of the times. He seemed to be a man from another century by then.
The great paradox of Herbert Hoover was that he had a reputation, a justifiable reputation, as being the great humanitarian for his work in World War I and for his work even as Secretary of Commerce under Calvin Coolidge. He understood how if businesses were prosperous, the families who were dependent on the breadwinners who worked for those businesses would be better. But he could not get into his head the notion that the federal government had a role to play in direct humanitarian aid to hard-stricken families.
Hoover is a real object lesson in the limitations of intelligence, experience, and even attentiveness in an effective president.
By the time Herbert Hoover ran for re-election in 1932, nearly a quarter of the nation's workforce was unemployed. Millions of Americans had lost their life savings. Entire communities were starving. And the farm economy was beyond the brink of disaster.
Now the battle must be continued. We have yet to go a long ways and to capture many positions to restore agriculture and employment. But it can be made plain that if the strategy which we have established is maintained, and the battle not halted by change in the midst of action, we shall win.
Herbert Hoover had an unprecedented reputation for managing crisis and tapping into America's voluntary spirit. Yet in the face of an agricultural crisis, a stock market collapse, massive unemployment, and the failure of the international banking system, Herbert Hoover lost the confidence of the American people.